I didn't recognize the handwriting, but I knew the words weren't meant for me to see. The note wasn't threatening, yet my hands started shaking as I read it. Something about it felt rehearsed, deliberate, and wrong. And the moment I showed it to a teacher, I realized the silence around me was no accident. If stories like this make you feel that quiet tension in your chest, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what unfolds next. I found the note at the bottom of my school bag, folded tightly, hidden beneath books I hadn't opened that day. At first, I assumed it was a mistake, someone else's paper, a forgotten reminder. But when I unfolded it, my name was written clearly at the top. Not printed, written. The message itself was short, calm, almost polite. It talked about keeping things simple and not making unnecessary trouble. It ended with a sentence that stayed with me long after I read it. You don't want people asking questions. I read it 3 times, trying to understand what it meant. There was no signature, no explanation, just an assumption that I would understand the warning. I didn't. The rest of the day felt strange. I kept checking my bag, as if the note might change or disappear. I watched the people around me more closely than usual. Classmates laughed, teachers lectured, announcements played over the speakers. Everything looked normal, but I felt exposed, like someone was watching how I reacted. I tried to ignore it. By the end of the day, that felt impossible. I didn't tell my friends. I didn't tell my parents. Something told me not to. Not yet. I needed to understand whether this was serious or just someone trying to scare me. The next morning, I decided to show it to a teacher I trusted. She was calm, experienced, the kind of person who didn't overreact. I thought she'd read it, shrug, and tell me not to worry. That's not what happened. She read the note slowly, then she read it again. Her expression changed in a way that made my stomach drop. Not panic, not anger. Recognition. She asked where I found it. I told her. She asked if I had shown it to anyone else. I shook my head. She didn't give it back to me. Instead, she asked me to wait in the hallway. That was when everything changed. I could hear voices through the classroom door, low, urgent. Another teacher was called in, then someone from the office. The bell rang, but no one told me to go to class. Students walked past me, confused, whispering. I kept my eyes on the floor, pretending I wasn't standing alone outside a locked room with my name being discussed inside. Eventually, I was escorted to the office. The walk felt longer than it should have. People looked at me differently, not suspicious, but careful, like they didn't want to say the wrong thing. In the office, they asked me questions, not about the note exactly, but about me, my routines, my friendships, my behavior, whether I'd noticed anyone acting strangely around me. It felt less concern and more like assessment. I asked what the note meant. No one answered. They told me they needed time, that they would handle it, that I had done the right thing by showing it to an adult. Then they sent me back to class. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Teachers avoided my eyes. One student asked if I was okay, then quickly said never mind when I didn't answer fast enough. When I got home, my parents were already waiting for me. That alone told me something was wrong. They didn't yell, they didn't accuse. They asked me to sit down and tell them everything. When I finished, they exchanged a look I'd never seen before. Not surprise, fear. My mother asked if I had been asking questions at school. I said yes, normal ones, about things that didn't make sense, about decisions that seemed unfair. My father sighed and said, "That's what we were afraid of." That sentence hit harder than the note itself. They admitted that weeks earlier, the school had contacted them. Someone had raised concerns about me, not behavior, not grades, influence. They said I was encouraging others to question authority, that I was asking questions that could create problems. The wording was careful, but the message was clear. Someone believed I was dangerous. The note hadn't come from a student. It had come from an adult, someone who believed they were protecting the system by warning me quietly instead of confronting me openly. I felt betrayed, but not surprised. Pieces started clicking into place. The subtle changes in how teachers spoke to me, the sudden meetings I wasn't told about, the way certain adults watched me more closely when I spoke in class. I asked who wrote the note. My parents said the school wouldn't say, but I already had a suspicion. There was one teacher who always shut down my questions, one administrator who smiled too politely when I spoke, someone who believed control mattered more than understanding. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed every interaction in my head, every time I'd spoken up, every moment I'd noticed tension but ignored it. I realized then that the note wasn't meant to scare me into silence. It was meant to test me, to see if I would back down. I didn't. The next day, I walked into school calmer than I'd ever felt, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I understood the game now. Silence wasn't safety, it was compliance. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't mention the note. I paid attention. And as I did, I began to see just how many people were being quietly guided, corrected, and warned without ever realizing it, and how my decision to show that note instead of hiding it had disrupted something much larger than me, setting in motion reactions that couldn't be undone. Because once secrets start surfacing in the open, they stop belonging to the people who created them, and what followed would prove that warning me had been the worst mistake they could have made. Once I understood that the note was never meant to protect me, everything around me sharpened into focus. The halls didn't feel threatening anymore. They felt managed, controlled in quiet ways that only become obvious once you know what to look for. I noticed how certain students were praised for agreeing quickly, how others were gently redirected when their questions lingered too long, how participation was welcomed, but only when it stayed within invisible boundaries. I had crossed one of those boundaries. The teacher I suspected avoided me completely now. When I raised my hand, she called on someone else. When I spoke anyway, she smiled tightly and moved on. No correction, no discussion, just dismissal. That silence was louder than any argument. At lunch, a classmate asked me why a counselor had pulled her aside earlier. She said she'd been told to be careful who she listens to. The wording felt familiar. I didn't answer right away. Then I asked what she thought it meant. She shrugged, uneasy. I think they meant you. That was confirmation. The note wasn't a one-time warning. It was part of a pattern. Quiet pressure applied wherever questions started spreading. I hadn't been singled out because I was wrong. I had been singled out because others were listening. The school called my parents in for another meeting. This time, I was invited too. That alone was new. The administrator spoke calmly, professionally, about maintaining a positive learning environment, about ensuring discussions remained constructive, about how influence among students could be misinterpreted. I listened carefully. When I asked what influence they meant, the room went still. The administrator chose words carefully, explaining that curiosity was good, but questioning decisions publicly could undermine confidence. I asked whose confidence. No one answered directly. That was when I realized the betrayal wasn't personal. It was systemic. Someone had decided that quiet control was easier than open dialogue, that guiding students behind the scenes was preferable to engaging with them honestly, and when that control was challenged, it responded with silence and warnings instead of transparency. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I asked if asking questions was against the rules. They said no. I asked if encouraging discussion was against the rules. They hesitated, then said no. I nodded and thanked them for their time. That meeting changed something, not immediately, but subtly. Teachers began watching their words more carefully around me. Counselors stopped pulling students aside casually. The note, once meant to isolate me, had drawn attention to a practice they didn't want examined too closely. I had done something unexpected, not by pushing harder, but by refusing to retreat. I started speaking less, but more deliberately. When I asked questions, they were precise, calm, impossible to dismiss as disruptive. I made sure others were present when I spoke, not to embarrass anyone, but to keep everything in the open. The reactions were telling. Some adults relaxed, others became tense. The teacher I suspected finally approached me after class one day after school. She said she hoped I understood that everyone was just trying to do what's best. I asked if writing anonymous notes to students was part of that. Her face changed. Just for a moment. She didn't deny it. She said sometimes gentle guidance was necessary when students didn't understand the bigger picture. I asked why no one trusted me enough to explain that picture instead. She didn't answer. That was when I knew I had been right to show the note instead of hiding it. Secrecy depends on compliance. The moment it's exposed, even quietly, it loses its grip. Word spread slowly, not rumors, awareness. Students noticed fewer warnings being given privately, more conversations happening openly, teachers asking questions instead of issuing quiet suggestions. The system adjusted because it had to. The administrator who had spoken so confidently in meetings began avoiding direct conversations with me, not hostile, cautious, as if aware that anything said could now be questioned. At home, my parents noticed the shift too. They admitted they hadn't realized how much control happened quietly at school, how easily concern could slide into management. They supported me, not loudly, but consistently. The note disappeared from conversation. No one referenced it again, but its impact remained. The person who wrote it had wanted silence. What they created instead was scrutiny, and scrutiny doesn't go away once it starts. I realized then that revenge didn't need confrontation. It didn't need exposure. It simply needed the truth placed where it couldn't be ignored, shared with the right people at the right time in the calmest way possible. The note had been meant to stop questions. It had done the opposite. And as the weeks passed, it became clear that the person behind it understood their mistake too late, because the authority they relied on now required explanation instead of obedience. And once that shift happens, it can't be undone, setting the stage for consequences that wouldn't look dramatic, but would be permanent, unfolding quietly as the system corrected itself around the silence they could no longer control. The change didn't announce itself. It didn't come with memos or assemblies. It showed up in pauses, moments where adults hesitated before steering a conversation, where they chose to explain instead of redirect. That hesitation told me everything. People had started paying attention. The teacher I suspected stopped avoiding me and started being careful. She invited discussion in class again, but now she framed it with open-ended questions instead of conclusions. When students disagreed, she didn't shut it down. She listened. It wasn't an apology. It was an adjustment. I could see the strain in her posture when conversations went places she couldn't easily guide. Control is exhausting when it's challenged quietly. Other teachers followed suit. Counselors changed how they spoke to students. Less, be careful, more, tell me what you think. The school didn't admit anything had been wrong, but the behavior told a different story. One afternoon, a student council meeting included an administrator for the first time in months. They sat at the back and observed. When a student raised a question about decision-making transparency, the administrator didn't interrupt. That alone felt significant. The person who had written the note tried to reframe the situation indirectly. I overheard them telling a colleague that students were misreading guidance as control. The colleague nodded politely but didn't agree. That was new. I noticed the writer's influence shrinking, not dramatically, just subtly. They weren't consulted first anymore. Their suggestions were weighed instead of accepted. Their authority required explanation. I never confronted them. I didn't need to. Every time they spoke with certainty, someone asked a follow-up. Every time they implied concern, someone asked for specifics. Specifics are dangerous to people who rely on implication. The betrayal, I realized, wasn't that someone wrote a note. It was that they believed they could shape behavior without accountability, that they could protect a system by quietly intimidating a student instead of trusting dialogue. I wasn't angry anymore. I was curious about how often this had worked before, how many others had gone silent after receiving similar warnings, how many had assumed the problem was themselves. That thought stayed with me. So I did something else unexpected. I started asking others how they felt when their questions were redirected. Not accusing, not probing, just listening. Stories emerged, small ones, careful ones. A counselor's comment here, a teacher's warning there. Nothing overt, but enough to show a pattern. I didn't collect evidence, I didn't keep records. I let people speak. And once people start speaking, they don't stop easily. The administration noticed, not because anyone complained, but because the atmosphere shifted. Meetings lasted longer. Decisions took more discussion. Silence no longer smoothed things over. One day, the principal asked me to speak with him privately, not in the office, in a neutral space. That mattered. They asked how I felt about school lately. I answered honestly. I said I felt heard. They nodded, then said something telling. We're rethinking how guidance is handled. They didn't say why. They didn't need to. The person who wrote the note was reassigned shortly after. Not punished, reassigned. Moved away from roles that involved quiet influence over students. It was framed as a professional adjustment. They didn't look at me when it happened. I felt no triumph, just relief. The system didn't collapse, it corrected itself, slowly, carefully, in a way that allowed everyone to save face while removing the behavior that caused harm. That's how real change happens. At home, my parents noticed how much lighter I seemed. They asked fewer worried questions. They trusted me more. They admitted they hadn't known how deeply school dynamics could shape a student's sense of safety. Trust rebuilt itself through consistency. The note was never mentioned again. It didn't need to be. Its purpose had been neutralized the moment it left my bag and entered the open. I learned something important during that time. Secrets don't always explode when revealed. Sometimes they dissolve. They lose shape. They become manageable once they're no longer protected by silence. The revenge, if it could be called that, wasn't personal. It didn't target the person who wrote the note directly. It targeted the practice that allowed it, and that practice changed. The final confirmation came during a class discussion weeks later. A student asked a challenging question, one that would have been shut down before. The teacher paused, considered it, and said, "That's worth examining." No warning, no redirection, no quiet note slipped into a bag. I felt something settle then, a sense that whatever had been threatened by my questions had been replaced by something sturdier, transparency. The person who once believed silence could guide behavior learned the opposite lesson. Silence invites scrutiny when it's broken, and once broken, it can't be restored the same way. As the year moved on, I stopped thinking about the note entirely. What mattered was the environment it had helped change, the conversations it had forced into the open, the authority it had quietly redistributed. I didn't need closure from the person who betrayed my trust. I already had something better, a system that listened. And as that understanding took root, I knew the story was moving towards its natural end, not with confrontation or confession, but with a calm, unmistakable shift in how power moved through the halls, a shift that would endure long after the memory of a single note faded, because the silence it tried to enforce had been replaced by something stronger, something that would carry forward on its own. By the time the school year began winding down, the atmosphere felt different in a way that was hard to explain to someone who hadn't lived through the shift. It wasn't louder, it wasn't dramatic, it was steadier. Conversations felt less guarded. Questions no longer caused tension to ripple through a room. The invisible lines that once existed were still there, but they were no longer enforced through fear or silence. I noticed it most in small moments. a teacher admitting they didn't know the answer and inviting the class to explore it together, a counselor asking a student what they thought instead of telling them what to think, an administrator staying present during discussions instead of stepping in to redirect them. None of this was credited to me. It didn't need to be. The person who had written the note faded further into the background. Their presence became polite, distant, procedural. They weren't excluded, but they were no longer central. Their influence had been replaced by something broader and more accountable. Once, as I passed them in the hallway, our eyes met briefly. There was no anger there, just something like resignation, as if they understood that the quiet methods they relied on no longer worked here. That moment gave me more closure than any apology could have. I never told anyone who wrote the note. I never needed to. The truth had already done its work. Naming them would have shifted the focus back to individuals instead of systems, and that wasn't the point. The betrayal wasn't one person's decision. It was the belief that silence was safer than honesty. I carried that lesson with me beyond school. I started noticing similar patterns elsewhere, situations where people tried to guide outcomes quietly instead of trusting open dialogue. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. But I also learned something else. Revenge doesn't have to harm to be effective. What I had done wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, it didn't embarrass anyone publicly. It simply refused to cooperate with secrecy. And in doing so, it removed the power secrecy depended on. Near the end of the year, the principal gave a short address to students about communication and trust. They spoke about how institutions grow stronger when questions are welcomed instead of managed. No mention of the past, no acknowledgement of mistakes, but the message was clear. I watched the faces around me as they listened. Some nodded, some looked thoughtful, some looked relieved. I felt calm. That night at home, I thought about the moment I found the note, how small it had seemed, how easily I could have ignored it, how close I had come to putting it back in my bag and telling myself it didn't matter. If I had, nothing would have changed. Silence would have won. Instead, I had trusted my instinct to bring it into the open, not dramatically, not defiantly, just honestly. And that had been enough. The next year would bring new challenges, new questions, new people in positions of authority. But the culture had shifted just enough to make those challenges different, healthier. I didn't think of myself as brave. I hadn't set out to change anything. I just hadn't accepted being quietly controlled. That distinction mattered. When I finally cleaned out my bag at the end of the year, I half expected to find something else tucked away. Another warning, another attempt at silence. There was nothing, and that absence felt like confirmation. The system no longer needed to test me. It had learned that quiet pressure didn't work where transparency existed. I understood then that the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones hidden carefully. They're the ones enforced through silence, passed off as protection, and left unquestioned. Breaking that silence doesn't require force. It requires presence. Looking back, the moment everything changed wasn't when I found the note. It was when I refused to carry it alone. That choice reshaped more than my own experience. It reshaped how power moved, how voices were heard, and how trust was rebuilt without anyone having to admit fault out loud. That's how real justice often looks. Not dramatic, not punishing, just quietly inevitable. And once it takes hold, it doesn't let go.